Okay, Mark, one of my previous interviewees, Neil Channing, tells me that you used to play poker together, tournaments in the 90s. And then in 2004, you actually acquired Paradise Poker as part of your online business. So when did your interest in poker actually begin?
Yeah, actually, Simon, it might have been the 2000s, the early 2000s. And basically, as the internet gambling world started to take off, it was sort of bookmaking and casino originally. But I guess it was about 2002, 2003 sort of time period, I became aware of the fledgling online poker business. And as the person in Sporting Bet who was the person with the gambling industry background, I was responsible for product, and I didn't know how to play this game. So I went and basically I used to play single dollar tournaments online at Paradise Poker. They used to have the daily dollar, and it used to start about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So I used to go into the office about 6 in the morning, get all my work done up till 2 o'clock, just to gamble a single dollar. Anyway, long story short, I eventually learned some basics. I was also doing some other research in and around that time. And then, well, what happened? A couple of things happened. A very interesting place just down the road from the Sporting Bet office opened called the Gut Shot Club on Clerkenwell Road. And Kenny Alexander, who's now the boss of GVC, used to work for Sporting Bet in those days, and he and I were flat sharing in London. And we had great difficulty in walking past the Gut Shot Club to get back to the flat after work. So we were getting there a little bit. But in particular with regard to Neil, there was a, this was, I don't know, 2004, 2005, something like that. There was a, poker rooms were coming back into popularity again in the casinos. And the sportsman, I think it was more like a £200 buy-in. And I used to play there. I used to see Neil there. I think I might have seen him a couple of times on UK Poker Tour events. I was very much part-time, and I think Neil was a very successful player in those days.
Okay, there was a huge boom, as you mentioned there, in poker in the late 90s into the early 2000s, largely attributed to the moneymaker effect. And then the bust. And the mention of October the 30th, 2006 in the UIGEA must still send shivers down your spine. How was that day and how did it feel?
Well, it does, you're quite right. UIGEA, as we referred to it, it was the most strange day. Well, what had actually happened, it was a Friday, I think, it might have been a Thursday or Friday, and I was leaving London to drive home to Herefordshire, where my family was still based. I was a bit of a weekly commuter to London, and I started off my drive. Our chairman, Peter Dix, had been arrested a few weeks before in the US and had been up on an extradition from the state of New York, I think, where he'd been arrested, down to Louisiana. And long story short, the phone call I got was he was not to be extradited, no case to answer, and he'd been allowed to board a flight and he was on the way home. So that moment in time was absolute euphoria. And we thought, well, you know, that's wonderful. But with this monumental collision of two events in that 3.5, 4 hour drive home for me, about 3 hours later, Nigel Payne, who was our chief exec, rang me to say, there's a bill moving in Congress in the US, and it was basically the wrap-up bill. At the end, they always do a finance bill, and sometimes there's political manoeuvring to tack other things on that they want to sort of sneak through without going through their normal parliamentary process. And we had lobbyists in the States, and they'd advised us and keeping us abreast that there hadn't been any likelihood. It's the last session before people went home to fight an election in their own states, their own constituencies. But unbeknown to us, there had been some manoeuvrings behind the scene, and they tacked on the so-called Safe Port Act onto the finance bill, and that piece of legislation became known as UIGEA, Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, if I remember correctly. And that really was something of a shock. And if I remember correctly, we had a share price up in the 380s to £4 sort of range. And I think in a matter of days, as the markets understood the following week, as the markets digested that news, our share price fell to something like 30 pence. It was, that was something that actually focused me on making money far more than when we'd been creeping along, evolving in terms of the value of our shares, because that was a single defining moment. It was probably my worst ever day in the game.
What was the motivation in America for that then? Do you remember what was the driving force for that law to come in?
The driving force, if I'm really frank, I think the US market is quite protectionist. I think that they saw this as something which was taking money out of the US, and it absolutely was. You know, that's correct. Not only us, you know, others. I won't name all of them. Some of them have tried to rewrite history and pretend they weren't in the American market. And then there was a big offshore industry down in the Caribbean, Central America, and other bits of the world as well. You know, there was a huge supply industry, and the reason why there was a huge supply industry was, it's the old argument against prohibition, really. The public wanted it. There was significant parts of the US that wanted to be able to place a sports bet in a state other than Nevada. They wanted to be able to place an online casino bet. They wanted to be entertained. And this new distribution channel came along, and the American authorities were slow to, first of all, clamp down on it. We operated in a grey area, I suppose, in American law, but UIGEA absolutely clarified that.
So you took the decision to get out altogether in 2007, if that's correct?
No, we had to be out. There were 13 days between this going through Congress and being signed by the President. So we were out, I think, in early, like 12th or 13th of November, I think, and we had no choice, we had to. And it was an amazing time because with so many shareholders and a big value of the company, we could not make a mistake. So we ran to as many lawyers to get as many legal opinions on any loopholes and workarounds that we could find, and we couldn't. And at the same time, we were running in parallel. We were running a process to try and save the jobs and the people. You know, the easy thing would have been to close down completely, and then we'd have had huge termination costs. But we actually were able to structure a deal where the management team of the operation, which was based in Costa Rica, took over, and we just had to get it off our books. And then, yeah, the other thing, the remaining part of the company had to be downsized and had to be reforecast, and all of this had to happen in such a short space of time.
Am I correct in thinking that some of your competitors, or at least one of the big ones, appeared to just ignore the law and carry on making fortunes? Do you think in hindsight you could have done things differently?
I don't think any of the public companies stayed in the space, and the reason is quite simple. What UIGEA did was it made the underlying act illegal, and the purpose of transporting money for that underlying act was therefore converted into money laundering. And money laundering is internationally extraditable, and that took away the loophole that we had operating out of other jurisdictions. So I don't think it was probably any major bookmaker. I think the old school American bookies, who always thought they were illegal anyway, I think they completely ignored it and carried on as normal down in the Caribbean, Central American areas. The one thing that did happen was that the poker companies who had a skill game argument, some of the poker companies carried on. So they did ignore it, but they had a completely different argument in that UIGEA did not define illegal gambling, and their argument was they were not illegal gambling as a game of skill. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So had things been different, and you remained the biggest fish in the poker world, with none of these laws, would you have run it so it remained sustainable and popular over the years? And have the current companies done it wrong? And was it a fad that's just had its day now? Online poker.
Good question. I suppose we would have carried on running it in much the same way that the big operators, and you know, they're by far and away the biggest, so I'm going to refer to Stars here. I'd love to think, you know, I'm a big fan of Stars. I think they've got great software, they've managed to crack the market, therefore they have great liquidity on their site. I think we would have aspired to running it something like that, so our fairly rinky-dinky early stage software would definitely have had to adapt. I do think these days that they're probably just a little bit greedy in grabbing the money off the customers too quickly. They're not giving them such good value. The rake and some of the terms and conditions around using their site do make it hard now for professional players to make money. And you should never forget, in a liquidity game like poker, you need these people who are providing liquidity into the pools. So might we have just been a bit friendlier to those sort of players? Perhaps we would. Otherwise, I can't tell you we'd have been drastically different in terms of how the poker market is evolved. I think for us as well, as being a poker operator, we saw the evolution of Sportingbet and our different brands as brands, and we tended to think about whatever the product offering is in relation to the brand, so that we could then cross-sell. So for us, it wasn't poker as a standalone, it was poker and sports and casino. And therefore, to give the full product offering, if you came to any of our brands, you knew you had a full product range to choose from as a consumer.